All right. We are still in the Transcendental Dialectic. We're on to Book 2, Chapter 2, the Antinomy of Pure Reason. Not to be confused with amphiboly or many other things that I confuse it for. Okay, let's just go. In the introduction of this part of our work, we have shown that all the transcendental illusion of pure reason rests on three dialectical inferences, the schema of which is supplied to us by logic in the three formal kinds of inferences of reasons, or syllogisms, in roughly the same way in which the categories find their logical schema in the four functions of all judgments. The first kind of these sophistical inferences is aimed at the unconditioned unity of the subjective. The unconditioned unity of the subjective conditions of all representations of the subject or the soul. Unconditioned unity of the subjective conditions of all representations of the subject or soul. It corresponds to the categorical syllogisms of reason, the major premise of which, as a principle, asserts the relation of a predicate to a subject. The second kind of dialectical argument will, in analogy with the hypothetical syllogisms, take for its content the unconditioned unity of the objective conditions in appearance. The unconditioned unity of the objective conditions in appearance. Okay? And the third kind, which has to be treated in the following chapter, will be concerned with the unconditioned unity of objective conditions of the possibility of objects in general. And my understanding, vaguely, is that I think in the previous section, Kant was concerned with logic not serving certain arguments that are maybe beyond logic or beyond our comprehension, or just can't be, reasoned out by us for various reasons, in certain logical pitfalls that we fall into in order to fill in gaps that we actually can't fill, etc., etc. It's obviously an oversimplification. But my understanding is the antinomies are antinomies. Sorry, I think I'm saying antimony. I'm not sure. Antinomy are that they are concerned in it with a similar issue, logical issues. But this one is effectively you have something you're trying to prove, beginning of the universe, end of the universe, etc. And what you have is the there are two extremes at which you could arrive at potentially, and they're both either equally true or equally false. And then you're left with a situation where it's like, okay, well, if that can't be the case, that the universe doesn't have a beginning, and it also is the case that the universe must have a beginning, this is an issue with our reason, right? And so he's going to give a bunch of examples of that and talk about that generally. Probably should have started with that, but I'm not like a fucking professor or something. Come on. All right. It is strange, however, that a transcendental that's what that shit was called in the previous section. I couldn't remember. Paralogism. I'm going to go with paralogism today because it makes me feel smart. It is strange, however, that a transcendental paralogism produced a merely one-sided illusion with regard to the idea of the subject of our thought, and that in mere concepts of reason, not even the slightest illusion can be found that would support the assertion of the opposite. Right. Meaning they gave us like kind of definitive answers, the paralogisms, and like, we weren't concerned with the opposite being true, even though our answer was ultimately faulty and or wrong. All of the advantage is on the side of pneumatism, although it cannot hide the hereditary defect by which it turns, for all its favorable illusion, into thin air when subjected to the ordeal of our critique. The case is totally different when we apply reason to the objective synthesis of appearances. Here reason tries at first with the illusion of great plausibility to establish its principle of unconditioned unity, but soon becomes entangled in so many contradictions that it must, with regard to cosmology, give up its claims to such unity. Okay? Unconditioned unity. For here we are met by a new phenomenon in human reason, namely, a perfectly natural antithetic, which does not come out of great rumination, or by artfully laying snares, but into which reason falls by itself and inevitably. I need some coffee. Reason is no doubt protected thereby from the slumber of an imaginary conviction, which is often produced by a merely one-sided illusion. But it is tempted at the same time either to abandon itself to skeptical despair or to assume a dogmatic obstinacy and take its stand on certain assertions without granting a hearing and doing justice to the arguments of the opponent. I feel like Kant really wanted to be a lawyer in some lifetime. Glad he wasn't. Maybe he was. I actually don't know. I assume he was just a professional scholar, but both attitudes are a death blow to sound philosophy. Although in the former, we might at least still speak of the euthanasia of pure reason. All right, let's take it easy. Because of skeptical despair as opposed to dogmatic obstinacy. Before showing the scenes of discord and confusion, producing the conflict of the laws, antinomy, of pure reason, we shall have to make a few remarks in order to explain and justify the method which we mean to follow in the treatment of this subject. I shall call all transcendental ideas, insofar as they concern absolute totality in the synthesis of appearances. I shall call all transcendental ideas, insofar as they concern absolute totality in the synthesis of appearances, world concept. Partly because of precisely this unconditioned totality on which the concept of the cosmic whole, being itself only an idea, also rests, and partly because they only refer to the synthesis of appearances, which is empirical synthesis. Okay. Okay. The absolute totality in the synthesis of the conditions of all possible things, on the contrary, must produce an ideal of pure reason. So the absolute totality in the synthesis of the conditions of all possible things. Totally different from the world concept, although in a certain sense related to it. Just as therefore, okay. I watched a lecture on this. So let me pause for a second. Synthesis of transcendental ideas insofar as they concern the absolute totality in the synthesis of appearance. Okay, totality. Okay. The absolute totality in the synthesis, on the contrary, must produce an ideal of pure reason totally different, although in a sense related to it. And my understanding is like, I don't know, there are kind of two concepts of the unconditioned unity. The one is like, if we're trying to trace back to like an original cause of something and figure out its unconditioned unity, like it's the reason for its existence. One way to do that is to start from 1, or maybe start from like 1,000, and then trace each. Well, it would be infinite, right? Might be the point, but and then to trace each back 999, 998, all the way back to the original one, whereby we arrive at some sort of concept that tells us where this thing started. Whereas there's another possibility of kind of a more universal, unconditioned unity, where instead of counting back from 1,000 to 1 to figure out that original seed, we are looking at each number in the chain kind of as a whole, universally, to determine the unconditioned unity and how everything comes together at once and tells us how we arrived at whatever it is we arrived at. I don't really know if that's exactly what he's getting to here, but it kind of sounds like it, and I'm just going to plant that flag, I guess. Just as, therefore, the paralogisms of pure reason form the foundation for a dialectical psychology, so the antinomy of pure reason will place before our eyes the transcendental principles of a pretended pure rational cosmology. And it does so not in order to show that this cosmology is valid and can be accepted, but, as may be guessed from the very name of a conflict of reason, in order to expose it as an idea surrounded by bedazzling but false illusion, and utterly irreconcilable with appearances. Alright, the Antinomy of Pure Reason, Section 1, System of Cosmological Ideas. Before we are able to enumerate these ideas with systematic precision, according to a principle, we must bear in mind 2 points. Firstly, that pure and transcendental concepts arise only from the understanding. Pure and transcendental concepts arise only from the understanding, and that reason does not, in fact, produce any concept, but at most frees the concept of the understanding of the inevitable limitation of possible experience. Okay, let me read that once more. Pure and transcendental concepts arise only from the understanding. That makes sense. We don't get pure concepts or transcendental concepts like from experience. We use the understanding to get there. And that reason does not, in fact, produce any concept. Right, we can't get the concept of something from reason alone. There has to be some sort of intuition, some sort of sense experience, some sort of basis for, something to provide us with the clay to form an actual concept. But at most, reason, it's talking about, frees the concept of the understanding of the inevitable limitation of possible experience. In other words, it's like takes it from experience and kind of frees it from the, the understanding which it is funneled through, and allows us to abstract it and extrapolate whatever it is we do, and just isn't it just isn't raw sense data anymore. And thus reason tries to extend it beyond the limits of empirical, but yet in connection with it. Reason does this by demanding for a given conditioned absolute totality on the side of the conditions under which the understanding subjects all appearances to synthetic unity. Demanding absolute totality, okay? It thus changes the category into a transcendental idea in order to give absolute completeness to the empirical synthesis, and does so by continuing it up to the unconditioned, which can never be met with in experience, but only in the idea. All right, so reason demands the totality of conditions, and it uses the category, changes the category into a transcendental idea in order to give absolute completeness to the empirical synthesis. Like, meaning it takes experience and empirical synthesis and turns it into, uses the categories to turn it into a transcendental idea, and continues to do that until we get the unconditioned, whatever that is. But presumably it's like some sort of first principle, or I don't know, something like that, which can never be met with in experience, but only in the idea, right? And we're not going to experience, the beginning of the universe. It's just going to be something that we have to reason to, if we can, which we can't, but we could if we tried and figured it out, but we won't. Reason makes this demand in accordance with the principle that if the conditioned is given, then the whole sum of conditions, and therefore the absolutely conditioned, is also given. Okay. Right, so if you give me 1,000, somewhere within it, I can reason myself back to 1 to continue stretching that metaphor. Hence, the transcendental ideas are firstly simply categories extended up to the unconditioned, and they must admit of being arranged in a table according to the head of the categories. But secondly, not all categories will lend themselves to this, but those only in which the synthesis constitutes a series, right? Series, interesting. And moreover, a series of conditions. And this is why Professor Gijsbers, I think, the lecture I watched, like, it is like sequential. It is based on a series, and we are trying to like extrapolate and or, digress back to some sort of beginning. A series of conditions for a conditioned which are subordinated to, not coordinated with, one another. Absolute totality is demanded by reason only with regard to an ascending series of conditions, and hence not when we have to deal with the descending line of consequences, or with an aggregate of coordinated conditions for the consequences. For with respect to the given conditioned, conditions are presupposed and considered as given with it. But on the contrary, since consequences do not render their conditions possible, but rather presuppose them, we can, in proceeding to the consequences, or in descending from the given condition to the conditioned, be unconcerned about whether or not the series comes to an end, and the question as to the totality of this series is indeed no presupposition of reason at all. Thus we necessarily think a time that has completely elapsed up to a given moment as also given, even though not as determinable by us. Okay. Yeah, I think I remember him talking about this too. This kind of means like, all right, so I have, by existing right now in this second, I've also experienced the past 5 seconds. And by experiencing the past 5 seconds, I've also experienced, the universe has arrived at, coming to the previous 10 seconds and so on and so forth. It's like everything is built up to the present in a way, and therefore everything is given at the current moment, if that makes sense. Completely elapsed up to the given moment as also given. Okay. But with regard to future time, which is not a condition of arriving at the present, it is entirely indifferent for our comprehension of the latter how we may think about the former, whether we may take it as coming to an end somewhere or as going on to infinity. Let us take the series MNO, where n is given as conditioned by m, and at the same time, and at the same time as a condition of O. Okay, so n is given as as conditioned by m, but at the same time as a condition of O. Okay, and let that series ascend from the n to its condition m, L, K, I, etc., and also descend from the conditioned n to the conditioned O, P, Q, R. I must then presuppose the first series in order to take n as given. And according to reason, with its demand for the totality of conditions, n is possible only by means of this series, while its possibility rests in no way upon the subsequent series, right? O, P, Q, R, which therefore cannot be considered as given, but only as debilis. I'm sure it's fine. I'm not looking it up. I shall call regressive the synthesis of a series on the side of the conditions. I gotta look it up now that I said that. I feel like a dick. But I feel like I understand it from the context. Capable of being given. But only capable of being given. Okay. I shall call regressive the synthesis of a series on the side of the conditions. That is, the synthesis beginning with the condition nearest to the given appearance and advancing to the more remote conditions. Regressive, that makes sense. Sounds like going backwards or, descending. The other, which on the side of the condition advances to the nearest consequence to the more remote ones, I shall call progressive. I shall grab my coffee, which is over here. It's 9:59 p.m. Let's check the score of the baseball game. Not very many good college football games on today. It's October 4th, 2025. I mean, Texas lost, but I don't think it was... It didn't appear to be a very good game. I watched some of it, but I got distracted by something. The former precedes... Okay, so we just did regressive and progressive. Regressive, obviously, going backwards in the to the things that the present is conditioned on, and then progressive is moving forward to the things that are conditioned by the present. Eventually, maybe. Okay, the former regressive proceeds in antecedentia to the second in consequentia. I don't know Latin, but I can figure those out. Cosmological ideas deal, therefore, with the totality of regressive synthesis and proceed in antecedentia and not in consequentia. When the latter does take place in consequentia, then it is a gratuitous, not a necessary problem of pure reason, because for a complete comprehension of what is given in experience, we do indeed require the grounds thereof, and not the consequences. Okay. In order to arrange a table of ideas, I was hoping for a table, in accordance with the table of the categories, we first take the two original quanta. Oh, the table's not on this page. Oh, it's on the next page. Okay. Of all our intuition, time and space. Time is in itself a series, and the formal condition of all series. That's right. And in it, therefore, we, with respect to a given present, we have to distinguish a priori the antecedentia as conditions, the past, from the consequentia, future. Time is in itself a series, And in it, therefore, with respect to the given present, we have to distinguish a priori. Okay, the antecedentia, like things that came before the present, as conditions. That makes sense, as we talked about. From the consequences, which is the future. Hence the transcendental idea of the absolute totality of the series of conditions of a given condition concerns all past time only. That makes sense. You can't know the future. According to the idea of reason, the whole of past time, as conditioned of the given moment, is necessarily thought as given. The whole of past time. There's like a... no, never mind. I'm not going to go off on a tangent. But I remember I was reading Finnegan's... I'll do the tangent anyway. I was reading Finnegan's Wake, and I read about this concept of... how can I explain it? Effectively, a fictional place where all of the world's information is stored. If that makes sense, like every possible factoid, like every possible bit of information. It's obviously like, it's like a hypothetical like thing, but there's like a name for it, and I tried to figure this out in like searching Wikipedia and stuff. It's as a concept, like a philosophical concept. And I literally, I haven't been able to find, and maybe it's just like a dream or some dumb idea I had myself and it doesn't actually exist, but I thought that it was a thing. If anybody knows that, let me know. So yeah. With regard to space, there is in it, considered in itself, with space, there's no distinction between progress and regress, because all of its parts exist simultaneously, and so space forms an aggregate, but not a series. Interesting. Okay. That makes sense. We can look upon the present moment, with respect to past time, only as conditioned, but never as condition, for this moment arises only through past time, or rather through the passing of the preceding time. But, as the parts of space are not subordinated to, but coordinated with one another, parts of space are not okay. Therefore, no part of it is the condition of the possibility of another, nor does space, like time, in itself constitute a series. Nevertheless, the synthesis of the manifold parts of space, through which we apprehend space, is successive. Well, it's because we experience in time, right? And hence it takes place in... look at that. And hence it takes place in time and contains a series. And since in this series of aggregated spaces, as for instance, of feet in a rod, those crazy like imperial measurements, I read about them for like half a day one time. I was just like completely enthralled by them. I don't know any of them like offhand, but it's like rod and league and I'm forgetting all of them. There's like pole and like then there's like 28 poles in a rod and 50 rods is a something, and it's crazy. It's absolutely nuts. I wish the United States would go to metric, but we never will. Willingly. Okay. The space is and since in this series of aggregated spaces, as for instance of feet in a rod, I want to look it up. The spaces added in thought to a given space are always the condition of the limit of the previous spaces. We ought to consider the measuring of a space likewise as a synthesis of a series of conditions of a given conditioned, with only this difference. Here, the side of the conditions is not in itself distinct from the other side, where the condition lies, so that in space, regress and progress seem to be the same. Right, like you could split up space, but it's the same on both sides, type of thing, or like the same. It's always considered fairly similar. Okay. As, however, one part of space is only limited, but not given by another, we must look upon every limited space as being also conditioned. insofar as it presupposes, we must look upon every limited space as being also conditioned, insofar as it presupposes another space as the condition of its limit. Okay, and so on. With reference to limitation, therefore, progress in space is also regress. Okay. And the transcendental idea of the absolute totality of the synthesis in the series of condition applies also to space. I may inquire, then, about the absolute totality of appearances in space, quite as well as in past time. But we must wait until later to see whether an answer to this question is ever possible. The absolute totality of appearances in space. Okay, I can't wait. Secondly, reality in space, that is matter, is something conditioned. Its inner conditions are its parts, and the parts of its parts are its remote conditions. Reality in space, that is matter, is something conditioned. And it's conditioned based on space. The inner conditions are its parts, and the parts of its parts are remote conditions. The inner conditions, okay. Hence we have here a regressive synthesis, the absolute totality of which is demanded by reason, but which cannot take place except by a completed division whereby the reality of matter dwindles away either into nothing or at least into that which is no longer matter, namely the simple. Consequently, we have here also a series of conditions and an advance of the unconditioned. Okay. Thirdly, when we come to the categories of the real relation between appearances, we find that the category of substance, with its accidents, does not lend itself to a transcendental idea. That is, reason has here no ground for proceeding regressively to conditions. Reason has here no ground. Okay. I gotta read that again. Thirdly, when we come to the categories of the real relation between appearances, we find that the category of substance, with its accidents, does not lend itself to a transcendental idea. That is, reason has here no ground for proceeding regressively to conditions. Okay. We know that accidents, insofar as they inhere in one and the same substance, are coordinated with one another, and do not constitute a series. And with respect to the substance, they are not properly subordinated to it, but are the mode of existence of the substance itself. Okay. What might here still seem to be an idea of transcendental reason is the concept of the substantial. This, however, signifies nothing but the concept of an object in general. Nothing but the concept of an object in general, which subsists, insofar as we think in it, merely the transcendental subject, without any predicates, and as we are here speaking only of the of the unconditioned in the series of appearances, it is clear that the substantial cannot be a member of that series. Okay, I'm going to go back a couple of sentences. What might here still seem to be an idea of transcendental reason is the concept of the substantial. This, however, signals nothing but the concept of an object in general, which subsists, insofar as we think in it, merely the transcendental subject without any predicates. Okay. And as we are here speaking only of the unconditioned in the series of appearances, it is clear that the substantial cannot be a member of that series. The same applies to substances in community, which are mere aggregates, without having an exponent of a series. For they are not subordinated to one another, they just exist beside each other, as conditions of their possibility in the same way as we were able to say of spaces, the limits of which were never determined in themselves, but always through another space. There remains, therefore, only the category of causality, which offers... Okay, I get what he's saying. He's talking about the analogies, isn't he? There remains, therefore, only the category... Well, I guess he's talking about the categories. Of causality, which offers a series of causes for a given effect, enabling us to ascend from the latter as the conditions to the former as the conditions, and thus to answer the question of reason. And causality makes sense for that because it's in a chain, right? This caused that, etc. Okay. Fourthly, the concepts of the possible, the actual, and the necessary do not lead to any series, except insofar as the contingent... Okay, so the possible, the actual, or the necessary, we talked about that for a while. It's kind of unclear as to why, but here it comes. Do not lead to any series, possible, actual, or necessary, okay, except insofar as the contingent in existence must always be considered as conditioned, and insofar as it points, according to the rule of the understanding, to a condition under which this condition... Oh god, I gotta start over. Fourthly, the concepts of the possible, the actual, and the necessary do not lead to any series, except insofar as the contingent in existence must always be considered as conditioned. So a contingent is always conditioned. That makes sense, because it's like not necessarily true, and it's based on something else by definition. And insofar as it points, according to the rule of the understanding, to a condition under which this condition itself must necessarily turn to a higher condition, until at last reason finds, only in the totality of the series, unconditioned necessity. If therefore we select those categories which necessarily carry with them a series in the synthesis of the manifold, then we shall have no more than 4 cosmological ideas, according to the 4 headings of the categories. Okay. 1. Absolute completeness of the composition of the given whole of all appearances. Okay, absolute completeness of the composition, okay, of the given whole of all, okay. 2. Absolute completeness of the division of a given whole in appearance. Okay, so composition, absolute completeness of composition, absolute completeness of division, 3. Absolute completeness of arising of an appearance in general. 4. Absolute completeness of dependence of the existence of the alterable in appearance. Okay. It should be remarked, firstly, that the idea of absolute totality refers to nothing else but the exposition of appearances, and not, therefore, to the pure concept of the understanding of a whole of things in general. Okay, the absolute totality refers to nothing else but the exposition of appearances, and not, therefore, the pure concept of the understanding of a whole of things in general. Okay. Appearances, therefore, are considered here as given, and reason demands the absolute completeness of the conditions of their possibility, insofar as these conditions constitute a series. Okay. That is, it demands an absolutely and it demands absolutely in every respect complete synthesis whereby appearances can be expounded according to laws of the understanding. Okay. Damn, baseball games. Mariners and Tigers are 2-2. Oh, sorry, spoilers. I should say spoilers first. Damn it. I doubt anybody's watching this that's hasn't watched the baseball game. They're very interested in not spoiling. Secondly, it is in fact the unconditioned if you haven't watched the game, go watch the game. Don't listen to this. Secondly, it is in fact the unconditioned alone which reason is looking for in the synthesis of conditions. Okay, the unconditioned alone is what reason is looking for. Continued regressively and serially, i.e., what it is looking for, as it were, a completeness in the series of premises, which taken together require no further premise. This unconditioned is always contained in the absolute totality of the series, as represented in imagination. I think this is a little bit what I was talking about before, with like the considering the counting back and then considering the whole as to figure out the unconditioned. But this absolutely complete synthesis is again only an idea, for it is impossible to know beforehand whether such a synthesis be possible with appearances. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. If we represent everything merely through pure concepts of the understanding and without the conditions of sensible intuition, then we might really say that for a given conditioned, the whole series of conditions subordinated to one another is also given. For the conditioned is only given through the conditions, right? When we come to appearances, however, we find a particular limitation of the mode in which conditions are given, namely, through the successive synthesis of the manifold of intuition, which synthesis should become complete by regress. Okay. Whether this completeness, however, is possible with regard to sensible appearances is still a question. I agree. I bet Kant figured it out, but I haven't. But the idea of this completeness is no doubt contained in reason, without reference to the possibility or impossibility of connecting with it adequate empirical concepts. As, therefore, in the absolute totality of the regressive synthesis of the manifold in appearance, a synthesis executed according to the categories, which represent appearance in a series of conditions of a given conditioned, the unconditioned is necessarily contained. We do not need to determine whether and how such a totality is attainable. Right, meaning if we consider the totality, the unconditioned must be somewhere within there, if we have everything. Hence, reason here takes the road of starting from the idea of totality through its final aim, though its final aim is indeed the unconditioned, whether that of the whole series or a part of a part thereof. This unconditioned may be conceived in two ways. It may be thought as consisting merely in the whole series, in which all members without exception would be conditioned, and only the whole of them would be absolutely unconditioned. That's what I was talking about. And in this case, the regress is called infinite. Or the absolutely unconditioned is only a part of the series, the other members being subordinated to it, while it is itself not subject to any other condition. In that former case, the series is a parte priori, without limits, without a beginning, that is infinite but given as a whole. That's okay. The regress in it, however, is never complete and can therefore be called infinite only potentially. In the latter case, there is a first member of the series, which, with respect to past time, is called the beginning of the world. With respect to space, the limit of the world. With respect to parts of a given limited whole, the simple. With respect to causes, absolute self-activity. And with respect to the existence of alterable things, absolute natural necessity. Okay? We have two expressions, world and nature, which sometimes coincide. The first denotes mathematical whole of all appearances and the totality of their synthesis, both in the large and the small aspects, that is, the totality of their synthesis as it progresses both by composition and by division. This same world, however, is called nature if we look upon it as a dynamical whole and consider not the aggregation in space in space and time in order to produce a magnitude, but the unity of the existence of appearances. Okay. In this case, the condition of that which happens is called cause. In this case, the condition of that which happens is called cause, and the unconditioned causality of the cause in appearance is called freedom, while the conditioned causality, in its narrower meaning, is called natural cause. The conditioned in existence in general is called contingent, and the unconditioned necessary. The unconditioned necessity of appearances may be called natural necessity. I have called the ideas which are at present discussing cosmological ideas, partly because we understand by world the sum total of appearances. Our ideas being directed to the unconditioned only among appearances, partly because the term world in its transcendental meaning denotes the absolute totality of the sum total of existing things, and we are indeed concerned only with the completeness of the synthesis, although properly only in the regress to the conditions. All these ideas are moreover transcendent, and although they do not surpass in kind their object, namely appearances, but deal merely with the world of sense, not with noumena, they nevertheless carry synthesis to a degree which transcends all possible experience. Hence they may all, according to my opinion, very properly be called world concepts. Okay, I'll allow it. With regard to the distinction, however, between the mathematically and the dynamically unconditioned, at which the regress aims, I would call the first two of these concepts world concepts in the narrower sense, referring to the world in both its large and small aspects, and would call the remaining two transcendent concepts of nature. This distinction, for the present, of no great consequence, may become important hereafter. Okay, I want to understand it because I think it does become important. I would call the first of these two concepts world concepts in a narrower sense, referring to the world both in its large and small aspects, and call the remaining two. So what is he talking about? No, mathematically and dynamically, which regress aims. This distinction, though, for the present is no... Okay, I'm sure I'll figure it out. Yeah. Right. Okay, I'm going to stop for now. That took 49 minutes. Was it 9 pages? Yeah, 9 pages. Oof, that's depressing. Okay, but yeah, then I'll move on to section 2. Section 2 is, I think, some introductory stuff, but then a bunch of examples that take up a lot of pages, but there's a lot of negative space, and it's kind of formatted kind of weird. But yeah, we'll take that on next, and yeah, so that should be like page 387 to like 419, I believe. So that'll be a pretty good chunk. And yeah, we'll keep plugging along. Nothing else to do.